to the backyard dealers. Many are actually being shipped out of province. So how is the government going to have any sort of control on that? Because let's say that the police hear that someone has gone, has stolen wire off a tank and has sold it to another individual. And the police show up and tell the individual, show us your records of all the metals you've bought. And the individual say, well, I didn't buy metals. I'm not registered to buy metals. I'm not licensed to buy metals. What are you talking about? There's nothing the police can say, well, no, you buy metals and because you're registered and we know that you're doing that, and if you're not registered, we're going to fine you because it's illegal to do so without being licensed or registered. That's where this fails, because the government got it wrong. And in their rush to try to send a message to Nova Scotians that something was being done, that's how they got it wrong. And that's why the Conservatives got it wrong when they tried to do so. Yes, we heard the stories of that old couple in Dartmouth. God loved them. What a reprehensible act, and the damage that was done to their home, that's been done to homes throughout Nova Scotia. There's nothing more horrible than having an oil leak around your property, what it does to your property, to your neighbor's property, not only the financial cost, but some will tell you, and many in the construction industry, that you never get rid of the smell of oil. It's almost like when you have a fire in a home. Most carpenters will tell you you'll never get rid of the smell as long as that home is standing. Oil is the same thing. But this bill will do absolutely nothing to put an end to that reprehensible activity because of the way the government has brought this in. So this is an example of legislation which tries to tell Nova Scotians we're doing something, but in the end will have, for all intents and purposes, no effect on putting an end to the reprehensible act of theft here in this province. Let us again, it's interesting because when you look at this government's priorities, it's one that it just baffles me, because last night I attended the diabetes dinner with many of my colleagues, and here the association is pushing for the government to fund insulin pumps. And the Minister of Health tells us, well, we need to study it more. 5 other provinces already have this in place. Now, let's ask ourselves, what about scrap metal? How many other provinces have legislation in place? Not one. So this government is a trailblazer when it comes to introducing legislation to clamp down on legitimate business dealers in Nova Scotia, yet we're following. Not only are we following, we haven't even gotten a commitment yet that this government is prepared to put in a plan to fund insulin pumps for diabetics here in Nova Scotia. Not one other jurisdiction has a similar legislation dealing with scrap metal dealers, but Nova Scotia is going to be the first. That's this government's priorities. Scrap metal over diabetes. That is an absolute shame, Mr. Speaker. And why is it not in other provinces? Is it only in Nova Scotia that we have the problem of people stealing metal and trying to profit in the sale of metal? I would suggest that in Alberta, for example, especially with the oil projects and the tar sands, that this is probably a much larger issue than it is here in Nova Scotia. And yet they have not brought in such legislation because it's simply not going to work. This is legislation that sounds good when you say it fast, but in reality, it is not going to work. Now, how is it not going to work, Mr. Speaker? Right now, the Minister has told us, well, in the regulations, he will set out exactly what metals are going to be involved in this, which would lead me to believe that it's only for specific types of metals, wires, and other materials. Yet, the bill requires logging every single transaction that a scrap metal dealer undertakes. So let's ask ourselves, is that reasonable? How many transactions does a scrap metal dealer undertake in a run of a day? During my briefing with Department of Justice officials, they advised that one of the largest dealers here in Halifax, on average, does 400 transactions a day. Not a week, not a month, a day. Now, can you imagine the work that's going to be required in logging all of those transactions. Better than that, one of the largest dealers here in Halifax is basically where the smaller dealers feed in. So my question was, if I go sell scrap metal to Wilf's Demolition in Loosedale, now he's going to take my license, he's going to have to mark down all the metals I bought, and then the next day they're going to ship it up to Jonathan Ross and Sons here in Halifax. And then the question was, are they going to have to log down every single piece of metal that Will's Demolition will bring to Jonathan Ross and Sons? They didn't really have an answer for that. They weren't really sure how that was going to work. Will the main buyer have to log the 400 transactions a day? That's some of the information that we don't have. And again, those dealers will tell you, people are not showing up with the small piece of copper pipe from an oil tank and coming to our business. Their businesses are not in the backyard. They're not hidden. They're well known. They're well publicized. And these are legitimate business dealers that right now this government has put the cloud of suspicion over their heads. At a time when we are seeing such difficulty in our economy, where we see of job losses, where we see of companies that are closing their doors, the Minister of Community Services would have us believe that this government bears absolutely no responsibility for the economic downturn taking place in this province. Yet they turn around and they bring in Bill 90 to tell business in Nova Scotia, we want you to have more red tape. We want you to go and hire someone to keep track of all these transactions, to have a photocopier in place to photocopy all of these driver's licenses and keep a log of every single transaction that takes place. Maybe the Minister of Community Services will blame Greece and Italy for the damage that will be done to scrap metal dealers. But in the end, this is a government that's coming in and saying at such a difficult time in our economy, first we're bringing in first contract arbitration, and now we're going to be sticking it to legitimate scrap metal dealers in our province. Mr. Speaker, again, the fact that anybody can start up a scrap metal buying and selling business and without having to be licensed, without having to be registered, is proof that this bill will not work. Because if someone is looking to go sell stolen goods, they will not be going to the legitimate dealer that's well lit, that's advertised, that has people coming and going all the time. That's not where this illegal stuff is going, and the scrap metal dealers will tell you that. No one's going to be bringing this type of illegal materials to legitimate dealers. So that's why I say that this is not going to work. If the government had truly undergone the consultation, and I spoke earlier about the meeting that the dealers had with the Minister of Justice, where he basically told them, say everything you want, this bill's going through, doesn't matter. And then the minister says, oh, we'll take care of all this in the regulations and we promise we'll be kind. You know, that's not a way to govern. I know that the former justice critic for the NDP, when in opposition, would have spoken against that. And I looked through Hansard at his comments when this bill was brought, expressing concern about the lack of consultation, expressing concern about what would be in the regulations. And yet, now in government, members sit silent watching the Minister of Justice do exactly what the previous Conservative Minister of Justice had done with this specific issue and with this specific type of metal. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that metal theft or any theft in this province has an impact on our economy, on our environment, and on Nova Scotians. But we need to be reasonable, and we need to be putting forward initiatives that actually have a hope of success. One of the questions that was asked, because initially when the government brought in their bill, which was basically a photocopy of the Conservative bill, was that dealers would have to report within 24 hours any suspicious metals which came into their possession. And the first question the police asked is, does that mean we need to have an officer there within 24 hours? And so the government had to withdraw that requirement because there's police forces in Nova Scotia that told the government that's not practical. We simply can't have a police officer within 24 hours, especially when one of the dealers in Halifax is doing 400 transactions a day. Unless you're going to be putting more police officers as a result of this legislation. The answer from the Department of Justice says that the Minister of Justice had no intentions. So this is another downloading onto our police officers, which we have to question, will it actually have the intended effect of putting an end to this theft? As well, the question has been raised is the continuity of evidence. And how do you take a piece of copper pipe that has no markings or identification on it and somehow take that after it's gone through the hands of a third party and identify it back to the person who actually stole it? That's a legal question that the government hasn't yet been able to answer. But I'm not surprised, because it never looked to answer that question, because Bill 90 sounds good when you say it fast. Safe collection of scrap metal. I don't think there was an unsafe collection of scrap metal. There may have been an illegal, but safe, that's some of the cute words that's being used by this government. Fair automobile insurance. Well, fair to who? Fair to the Nova Scotians who'll see their rates go up and will have to pay more for services they didn't ask for and were quite content with what they were paying. But that's some of the language that we're seeing by this government. Is everything safe? Everything is all these nice words that they're using, but at the end of the day, the question is, what impact is it going to have on Nova Scotians? And as I said before, Mr. Speaker, if the Minister of Justice can stand in his place and say, your oil tanks are safe, your wire is safe, your phone lines are safe because of this bill, that would be a different story. This government simply cannot do that, because this legislation is missing essential elements that without those elements being put in place, there is little to no hope of success. Nova Scotians deserve better. This bill is in essence a way of the government saying we've done something, when in reality this is not going to have the intended effect. Is there ways that we can try to find to make sure that oil tanks maybe do not use copper wire but have other means? It's my understanding that newer tanks do not use any copper at all. There's other means of piping that is used that is plastic for the most part, which would have little to no value to someone trying to take such a small length. So is there ways that we can make changes with the industry of trying to identify as to how we can discourage people from trying to cut lines from oil tanks? Right now, Nova Scotia Power and Alliance have said they've lost a lot of equipment, a lot of wire, a lot of copper. The question that scrap metal dealers have asked is that, is there a means of them to put markings under wires or under piping when they receive it, so that should it come into our possession or someone try to sell it, we could immediately identify, wait a minute, this is Nova Scotia Power's piping or equipment. Same thing for Alliant. That's some of the initiatives I think government should be working on, that government should be identifying and should be able to say, here's what we're going to do to try to make sure there are better markings and try to ensure that this material is not stolen, and if it is, it'll be easily identified. The scrap metal dealers raised the issue of much of this product is going outside the province. It's being taken by these unlicensed dealers, or they don't need to be licensed, but they're just backyard dealers, and they take it outside the province. And the response we got from the Department of Justice was that our minister had written to the Minister of New Brunswick asking for their help. So again, there is no coordinated approach to dealing with this problem, which clearly is not limited within the boundaries of Nova Scotia. For us, again, to me, it's nothing but sad to say we're trailblazers in dealing with scrap metals, yet we're still refusing to follow 5 provinces in providing insulin pumps for diabetics here in Nova Scotia. I think that clearly speaks to where this government is going. It is not the NDP party that was in Nova Scotia fighting for diabetics, fighting for Nova Scotians. Instead, it's now come to the point where survival while in government, bring bills in that make it sound good, where in reality, little to no effect is going to be achieved. Whereas when you have issues such as diabetes, government says it wants to study the matter further. So scrap metal doesn't require further study, but diabetes does. That's the message from this government. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are seeing more and more. The veil is being lifted, and they're seeing exactly what's behind that when it comes to this government. It's no longer about doing what's right. It's about doing what will possibly get them re-elected. Bill 90 is meant towards actually trying to be re-elected and not put an end to the reprehensible act of theft in this province.
Purely political.
It is a political bill. It is one that is going to add red tape to legitimate business dealers in this province. And at the end of the day, there is no proof that there will actually be a positive result to this. At a time when we're seeing businesses suffer from a government that's increased the HST by 2%, highest HST in all the country, that's increased user fees outside the legislature without ever having to justify it here in the House of Assembly, that continues to allow a tax on gas, which in opposition they called immoral. And yet now, for scrap metal dealers, the government comes to their help by bringing in a bill that will require them to keep track of every single transaction. And the message today from the Minister of Justice is, oh, I'll take care of it in the regulations. Those regulations should be before the House today. They're not here today because they're not even written yet, because the Minister hasn't yet decided what they will look like. So we're being asked to pass a bill which we do not know what the consequences will be to a legitimate industry that the government has targeted rather than working with to try to professionalize it and try to make sure that there's a better means of knowing exactly who is involved in the business. So trying to put regulations and burdens on an unregulated industry is simply not going to work. And let me say again, I'm not only saying this because it's a bill from the NDP. I said the exact same thing when the Conservatives brought it in when they were in government. If you look through Hansard, you'll probably find the comments are extremely similar. It was a bad idea then. It's a bad idea today. There's a reason why no other Canadian province has such legislation in place. We should instead be working with our police forces. We should instead be undergoing an advertising campaign to advise Nova Scotians to be wary, to protect their assets, protect their property, and discourage in every way possible theft from taking place in this province. Bill 90 will not achieve that, and it's unfortunate that the government has decided to use a bad idea from the former Conservative government, which they voted against at the time, and has now brought forward, in essence, the exact same piece of legislation. There's no reason why this bill cannot wait till the regulations are finalized. At that point, once we see the regulations, once the industry clearly knows what burden is being placed on them and what the expectations are, then is the right opportunity to have a discussion on this. But to ask for the passage of this bill at this point, I believe is not in the interest of Nova Scotians, it's not in the interest of scrap metal dealers, and it's not the proper way to do legislation or the proper way to govern in this province. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we also introduced a piece of legislation in this sitting, an act to regulate the sale of scrap copper and certain other scrap metal. And we did that because we wanted to send a message to thieves that there will not be a market to sell their stolen goods. I've also suggested that we should move beyond our province to ensure that we don't export that market beyond our borders. And thus, unless we get other provinces to do the same thing, this problem is just going to keep moving on. And I respect the member who just spoke. I respect his comments, and he's made some good points. But I do believe that a lot of these backyard scrap recyclers eventually have to go to a place of repute. And at some point, we need to give the police the tools they need to try to stop this activity. Because, Mr. Speaker, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a Nova Scotian who perhaps woke up one morning to an oil spill in their backyard, their property damaged, with the reality that they may have to leave their home for months at a time until the property is properly remediated, costing thousands of dollars. And for what? So that a thief can steal a piece of copper line, for the sake of a few dollars. So, you know, the problem goes beyond copper lines. We look at things like church bells, monuments, items that destroy irreplaceable fabric within our communities. I think of the Cemeteries Protection Act that we had introduced recently and was passed by this legislature, which is a rarity, Mr. Speaker, to have an opposition bill passed, but everyone saw the value in that. And that legislation is now in force, and if someone is caught damaging a cemetery, the penalties are much more severe. There's also industrial thefts that cost money and create delays on projects that impact jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, one point I'd like to raise is I wonder, you know, if we had not introduced this piece of legislation, would the government come out and introduce the piece of legislation we're speaking about today? It looks as if they may have scrambled to put it together. We were speaking about it publicly a couple of months back, and we feel that the legislation that we're speaking about today has some shortcomings. It doesn't do anything meaningful to discourage oil line theft specifically. It contradicts long-established legal tests, which mean more litigation, more costs, and more uncertainty, and more delay for the justice system when it's trying to adjudicate over these matters. And it violates principles of civil liberties, which is very surprising, considering that civil liberties have always been very important to the NDP. The bill we have introduced does more to address the problems, is more legally sound, it's less costly, and it's more respectful of civil liberties. Now, I want to get into specifics, Mr. Speaker. This bill that we're speaking about today does not make it an offense to buy and sell used oil lines. We know scrap dealers said it can be difficult to find an oil line and a load of scrap, but instead of abdicating responsibility, government should act, and action need not be unfair to scrap dealers. Legislation should make it illegal to buy or sell things that reasonably look like used oil lines. Only certified stallers are permitted to handle them anyway. So for the thief who cuts and steals a few oil lines, perhaps to buy drugs or some other item, why not take the market away from that thief? A dealer who finds one in a large load can call police and report the transaction. We have no problem with timely reporting of a pipe in a load being a defense for not reporting it sooner, or any other form of due diligence. Mr. Speaker, we need action today to stop scrap metal theft. The government bill has complications that are left to be ironed out, and they're going to have to be ironed out through regulations. That will eat up maybe a year while this practice continues and Nova Scotians continue to suffer from its impact. Our legislation addresses the heart of this issue, and we don't need to wait to create regulations to accomplish the same goal, because the legislation that we were proposing is very straightforward, and it doesn't require time to be spent drafting regulations outside of the legislation. If we look at civil liberties, with Section 5 of this legislation, an officer who decides they have grounds that someone's business is evidence can search that business. No warrant is required, and the consequence of a search can be charges and a jail sentence for a regulatory offense. There is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week process to get a warrant. If someone has grounds, they should go before a justice or judge and get a warrant. That's the way we do things, Mr. Speaker. Our legislation allows for a less intrusive inspection of a scrap dealer's records. If that does not satisfy police investigators, they then would have the option to proceed with obtaining a warrant for more extensive investigation. That would respect civil liberties, Mr. Speaker, and we also think it would make it the process more easier to adjudicate for the justice system. With the elimination of the need for warrants, this bill that the government has put forward is creating uncertainty with a poorly conceived act. In the legal system, uncertainty leads to more court proceedings, higher cost, and more delay, all of which are bad outcomes for all involved. And how does that help the victim of a copper line theft? So the proposed legislation will leave openings for the defense of a scrap metal dealer who has accepted stolen goods. for strict liability offenses like this, or to take a common example with the Motor Vehicle Act, an accused can resort to a handful of well-defined and well-known defenses. These rules are applicable through the Summary Proceedings Act. Due diligence is one and the most common, but there are others. Entrapment, officially induced error, and necessity are a proper way to deal with are other examples. With the government's proposed scrap metal theft solution, government is interfering with the well-established legal regime which works well and has certainty. So again, uncertainty equals more court time, more money, and delay. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that scrap dealers are better protected by the common law defenses. So, Mr. Speaker, we ask that the Minister reconsider the legislation that the government has introduced, and to take a closer look at the legislation that we have introduced, for it is a better solution to protect Nova Scotians from scrap metal theft. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry. I'm pleased to rise and speak a little bit today on Bill number 90, which is entitled the Safe Collection of Scrap Metal Act. And again, as my colleague from Richmond had said earlier, I'm not sure where these titles come from. The idea of introducing the word safe into that makes it sound kind of warm and fuzzy around scrap metal, but really there's no unsafe practices now. What he's talking about is illegal practices. And, you know, I think we have to sometimes question when we're using words in a way that circumvents the real truth of the matter. And, you know, really this is a revisit of a bill that had come before the House in 2008, Mr. Speaker. And I think that it's important for all members of the House that were here at the time to remember what the position was of the NDP government at that time and sort of where we are today. And at the time, it was a Conservative bill before the House, so it was a government bill. And it had a different name. It was called the Scrap Metal Dealers and Recyclers Act. And that was probably more to the point. That's exactly what it is really, and that's what should be called today. Not this safe collection business. It's not about the collection of scrap at all. It's about the theft of scrap metal and metals that are concerning the government, according to the minister when he made his opening comments. My concern is that we have not learned anything from recent history, from 2008 when this was brought before us. And at the time, there were some very strong opinions voiced by the scrap metal dealers who came before law amendments and had indicated that they had very little warning, no idea of the regulations, no detail that was going to give them any comfort that they would be able to abide by the regulations that were being proposed, although they hadn't seen them. It was a question of a lack of consultation and a lot of uncertainty for the people whose business, whose livelihood depends on knowing, you know, the ground rules. And here's an act that in 2008 was going to change those ground rules. Now, the minister at the time had a slightly different bent. He was very motivated by Nova Scotia Power and by thefts of metal around Nova Scotia Power facilities. And, you know, I think had promised Nova Scotia Power that he was going to do something about it. And if we remember correctly, when that bill came before law amendments, and we had a chance to listen, as the members of law amendments do, to the people that are being impacted, there was a strong feeling that the government had failed to consult with those business people, that we hadn't considered the impact on their business, and that there needed to be some sober second thought. And when it came to a vote at law amendments, the bill was held there. It did not pass through. It was outvoted. The government of the day was outvoted, and the bill could not move back to the House for third reading. And the reason for that, the reason that it got held up, was strictly because there had been no consultation. And what we've heard now with the introduction of this new bill by the now NDP government is that once again, the scrap metal dealers have been ignored, that despite their strong appeals for time with the minister, they were granted only a short time, and that they felt that they were really dismissed before they'd even begun, that their viewpoint was not being heard, that the minister's mind was made up, and that they didn't even really receive the courtesy of any opportunity to put their viewpoint forward. And Mr. Speaker, we felt that at the time that what was really needed was an honest attempt to look at how the changes that might be proposed were going to impact the scrap metal dealers. And I can say honestly that I don't feel we're any further ahead today than we were in 2008. I mean, that was a travesty in 2008, and I'm glad that it was a minority government and that the NDP stood up and helped to hold that bill behind and stop it in its progress before it caused any damage to a sector of our business community. And as was mentioned by the member from Richmond, the largest scrap metal dealer in the province is in the Clayton Park riding and has some other locations as well. That's John Ross and Son Scrap Dealer, and they, in a single day, can do 400 transactions at their location in Clayton Park. So 400 purchases and transactions with scrap metal. And anybody that can go up there and see, they have a big yard and there's a lot of activity. I might mention there's a lot of employment at that center. There are a lot of people depending upon it because it is a good job for people, and it's well located and people are employed there because it's making money. If we put an unnecessary burden on all of these scrap metal dealers, big and small, you're going to find that they just are not going to be able to make ends meet in this province. And we're going to be impacting employment again. We're going to be causing even more red tape, which is something that all governments should try and maintain a balance. You want regulations that are going to be useful and help in the safety and health of our individuals, protecting the people in our province. But you don't want to create unnecessary red tape and a burden on any business or industry. And we're creating a burden here not only on the businesses that are legitimate scrap metal dealers, we're creating a burden on our police forces, because who is going to look over all this paperwork? You're asking for an enormous amount of paperwork to be maintained and held and available, and the police don't have time to review all of that. And there's been a number of very practical points raised in the debate from the member from Richmond that point very clearly to why this is very really ineffective. What's being proposed here is going to be ineffective. And the reason for that are a number that stand out. Number one, the product we're talking about is generic. It's not marked or in any way identifiable. One bit of metal, whether it came from an oil tank or otherwise, is indistinguishable from another. And so it's very hard to identify thieves for something like that, from just, by making a rule that everybody has to provide their information, their personal information, that now the business has to maintain a record of all the personal information of everybody who has sold them any scrap metal. It's not necessarily going to get you any closer to finding the wrongdoers, the people who are causing harm in our province. Those are the people you want to get at. So number one, you have a generic, unidentifiable or unmarked product, which is very difficult to differentiate. And secondly, you have an industry that isn't regulated. So to be a buyer and a seller of scrap metal, I don't need to register. I don't need to be licensed by the government. So there are lots of legitimate businesses out there that we know, that the government can know of and identify, but there can be many others that are actually doing that, buying and selling and trading without being noted or known to the government. So it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to ensure that every single person that's engaged in that trade is going to be, part of this system, captured in this giant database of buyers and sellers. And, we're asking them again to maintain some very personal information, which means you're going to put a high level of safety and control on that. That's going to be difficult as well for the legitimate people that are trying to make a living, hire other Nova Scotians, and contribute to our province. So I think we need to look at those two things, the unregulated nature of the industry and the fact that the product is indistinguishable indistinguishable, one piece from another. It's going to make it very, very difficult. Mr. Speaker, I'd mentioned about the burden that this is going to place on the police forces, and a lot of that will become more clear when we see regulations. But I was reviewing what was said in 2008 here in the House when the member from Timberley Prospect actually had spoken, probably as I would say, the justice critic of the day. And, you know, his comments were definitely sympathetic about being concerned about the theft of anything metal. He spoke a lot about monuments and veterans' monuments and that sort of thing. Those may be identifiable. And let's go there for a moment. If somebody does steal a plaque that you could identify, and it is presented in that form to a dealer, you can be absolutely sure today that any of the licensed dealers would be reporting that. They are aware, and we've been told, and we were told in 2008 at law amendments, that when the police say a certain item has been stolen, either from a graveyard or a war memorial, church bells, memorial bells, things like that, the police automatically send out a fax or an email to all of the scrap metal dealers that they know, saying, be on the lookout for this, because this is something very important to the community and it's been stolen. And the dealers have, you know, many instances where they have responded to that. They do get back to the police. They have actually had arrests come from that kind of network of knowledge, where they're being informed by the police, and then the scrap metal dealers are doing their job too, to be honest and upright, which of course they would do. And so we already have that in place. We have a sector and people in that sector who are already cooperating and working closely with the police whenever they're called to do so. So, you know, we don't need to come down on this industry with a heavy hammer, is really what I'm saying. And what we see before us is that, exactly that. And the Conservative government did just the same thing. They came down with a knee-jerk reaction to a situation which, you know, interestingly enough, they abandoned after that because the prices of a lot of these metals went down. It was no longer as big an issue, and they just kind of went away and didn't bring it back. Now I see their critic has brought in their own bill, so they seem all gung-ho for this kind of regulation as well. But remember that one of the big unknowns in what's before us in this bill is what exactly will be written in the regulations. And I can tell you from my earliest days in the House, we learned very quickly that the government can write whatever they like in regulation. They can just fill their boots, basically, and go crazy writing things that can completely reverse the intent of a bill or take it to a level that was never intended. Bill 1, insurance bill, Bill 1. That's the example I'm using from 2003. And the regulations were unknown to the members of this House.
Regulations were very different.
And the regulations, and in fact, the current Minister of Finance actually himself spoke about how much they had circumvented the meaning in that bill from what was brought up here in the House. But of course, his memory's a little short. Some other things have taken on.
Check it out.
You know, and we know that was then. This is now. It's so different for the NDP today. They don't even look like the NDP anymore. That's how different it is. And people couldn't recognize the kind of legislation that's being proposed by this government. Their priorities, their motivation has completely evaporated. Their values have been changed. Now they're the law and order group now. That's one thing. Let's bring down the House in terms of you know, more boots on the street and law and order, and let's bring in bills that you can't even enforce. You know, this is foolishness. And yeah. That's right. You know, this may cost more. We're going to have to ask for some more police officers if you want to properly institute it. We know we've got a tight-fisted Minister of Finance, even if he says he has no directives to his colleagues or to their departments. I think we know better that there's somebody that is controlling the purse strings in government and really dictating to, not only directing, but dictating to the other members, other ministers who are responsible for departments themselves. You know, what I really think is we brought before us an act that, well, the circumstances that may have led to it coming to us in this instance, different from Nova Scotia Power, the minister's begun by speaking about homeowners and begun by saying that we want to help homeowners who've been harmed. And I agree with that entirely. We've certainly had thefts that I've been aware of in my area as well, and oil spills that have resulted. But I think that this is not the way that you're going to get there. And I know that the minister or member from Richmond also mentioned that there are other means. There are new kinds of oil tanks. There are other precautions, other ways that we can get there. Oil tanks that don't have copper on them, that aren't going to be easily, easily broken, so that you wouldn't have those kind of detrimental environmental, really catastrophes. They're expensive and they're devastating for the families that are affected. And I feel that too, but I think you have to be, especially in government, you have to be able to balance what's before you, what the problem was with individuals, or with homeowners, with people who've been robbed, and whether or not this bill is going to meet the needs of that condition, of that circumstance. Will it make it better for any of those homeowners? And I would say it won't. I just think that you're wasting your time and effort. You're wasting the money of a lot of legitimate business people. You're wasting their time. You're burdening the police force with a bunch of paperwork that they will never look at, that they will, if it's being sent to them, they'll be buried in this amount of paperwork. And it will never be analyzed or gone through or used for any useful purpose. So, bottom line is this is a bad idea. It was a bad idea in 2008 when it was brought forward, and it's a very bad idea today. It hasn't in any way improved where we're at. And again, to go back to the consultative piece, we knew in 2008 that the industry was not heard. Their concerns had not been registered or dealt with or in any way recognized. And the NDP at the time listened to that and voted against this bill at law amendments for that very reason. All 3 members of the NDP voted against it. And yet today, it's an NDP bill. Now, just go figure. What is this about? It would be great if you could show us that you've sat down with the industry, that you talked to the major players and the small scrap metal dealers, that you've looked at all of the factors of where the scrap metal is dealt with, where it travels to, how it crosses our borders, whether or not some of it, what percentage even, is never even handled here in our province. How much of it is put on trucks and taken to Quebec or out of province? We don't even know that. We know that we have active scrap metal yards, but we don't know how much is leaving the province untouched by any of those dealers. So, the fact that the government feels this is going to make a difference just shows a real naivete. It really does. That, maybe it's too complex, again, as the Minister of Finance likes to say, everything's so complex. Maybe this one just got to be too complex. So you brought in a bill that looks a whole lot like what we saw in 2008 from the Conservative government, and you're trying to deal with a problem that really needs to be worked out in consultation with the industry. And I think it's very telling that not one jurisdiction in Canada has brought in legislation, and they certainly are feeling the same stresses that we are here in Nova Scotia. It doesn't, it's called foolhardiness. It's called lack of consultation. It's called being indiscriminate. Yeah. Really leading the way without evidence, leading the way without consultation, leading the way in the dark is not leadership. We've got 2 extremes, as was said earlier. We've got a health minister that won't act when 5 provinces have taken action to introduce insulin pumps for their people. We can't act till we have more evidence. We have to do more research. We have to find out independent research, industry research, and so on and so on. Lots more money, lots more caution. And then we have a justice minister who thinks that he's the take charge law and order type. Yes. So he can just grab this issue, draft up a bill, and away we go.
I wonder he didn't get the big appointment.
And basically, never mind what the others say, never mind what the industry says. In fact, showing a level of arrogance to people who come speaking about their livelihood and about the jobs and the people that they represent, that they employ. That's pretty important. We've seen and we've talked about in question period and otherwise, large numbers of people out of work in this province, the workforce shrinking, most recently by 5,000 in the last year, 5,000 Nova Scotians, and we know where they are. Some of them have retired early and just left the workforce. Some of them have packed up the U-Hauls and they've gone out of the province. They've moved, and all you have to do is talk to your friends, people our age, and where are their children? Gone out of the province. Lost their work here, maybe in the call centres in New Waterford, or uncertainty around their future. They're gone. And all you want to do is create more uncertainty in that environment through this bill and through the newest bill you brought in today around this first contract negotiation or arbitration. Those sort of things just create a level of instability that this province doesn't need at this point in time. And again, if you would deal with people in a frank and straightforward way, give the time to the industry that you would have expected when you were in opposition, that you would have expected government to do. Mr. Speaker, I'm being interrupted. I am, and I would like you to talk to them.
Well, the honourable member used the word "you," and as you know, the Speaker of this House does not like the use of the word "you." So I would ask you to refrain from using the word "you" in further conversations today in this House. I would also ask the other members of this House to respect the individual who has the floor, and if you have conversations that you want to carry on, please feel free to take them outside the chamber. The member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't aware of what that heckling was all about, so I appreciate you pointing out the error of my earlier speech, and I will avoid any direct use of the word "you" in terms of speaking of the other members of the House. So we will direct our comments through you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 90, as I said, is a bad idea. It's a burden on business. It's going to be a burden on the police force. It's taking an approach that's sort of using a much larger method than is needed. The idea of consulting with industry would provide you with the answers, and I think you could find ways to achieve as much of the aim that you would get from this bill in a lot better way. But again, I'm going back to the regulations, which the Minister of Finance tended to disagree with, and yet I can tell you firsthand, I've seen regulations that have come out after bills have passed this House, when the regulations circumvented what we intended as members of the House when we voted on it. And I felt it was really an affront to the legislature when that happens. It can happen, though, and we have no control. Regulations are written by the departments in the back rooms and approved by Cabinet. So we don't get to see them again. We don't get to amend them or put our 2 cents worth in, and neither do the industries or the individuals who are impacted. And that's why today I'm very concerned that the scrap metal bill is here before us without any regulations. So we can't look at what the exact requirements will be for a business, and we won't be able to advise them about how damaging this is to their livelihood. And I can tell you that they are very alarmed and concerned, and they will be, I'm sure, before law amendments to say exactly that, and to ask that you spend more time consulting with the industry. If you're intending and not only intending but determined to make this happen and to push through a bill that doesn't seem to be necessary, then by all means do it in consultation with the people who are going to be impacted. I mean, the way you're going about it is a surefire way, the way the government is going about it is a surefire way to alienate Nova Scotians. One by one industry at a time, one employer at a time, one community at a time, you will alienate them all because you're well on your way with others, and now you want to pick up on this one. And the government is well on its way with others. And so for that reason, I think that there's a time for some sober second thought and a chance to get this a little bit better. Mr. Speaker, just for a couple of points that I think are germane to this discussion. The idea of the legitimate business trying to identify the scrap metal and determine just exactly what, whether or not it's a stolen piece is really the center point here to what we're discussing. Even if they get all the information from a seller as they come into the business and they purchase some scrap metal, there's no way to identify where that came from. And so, as I said, we're going to have hundreds and thousands of records maintained and no way to tie it back to the thefts that the government is concerned about. But I think it's important to look at convictions. And what we'd heard from the industry is that 9 out of 10 thefts, and even where they look into where it might have come from, they can't get a conviction. And the reason for that is because they can't determine exactly the evidence, like whether that was the stolen piece. And in fact, I think the member from Richmond, my colleague, used the term continuity of evidence. which provides me with a legal term that I wasn't aware of before. But really, continuity of evidence means it's unidentifiable, unmarked. And I think we have to remember that. That's just the nature of this product. And I'm sorry that it doesn't allow, easy identification so that we could punish the people who steal it, that we could track it down and identify it and say that they are responsible. But if you can't, then under our courts and our system, you will find that they are not convicted. And then you've just taken more court time and more again, police effort, prosecutors' efforts, and it's going to be for naught. So I think we need to look at that and see whether it actually makes a difference. And then again, in any jurisdiction where there's been more controls brought in, has there been any marked decrease in thefts? That's the next test. If you can look at a jurisdiction that has brought in some changes and see whether it actually made any difference. And one thing that I was told was that there are no jurisdictions in Canada, of course, that have this kind of legislation. But in some states in the U.S., they do have some further rules around this. And in fact, there are some states that actually require fingerprints when you sell copper. And even in those states where they've gone beyond your name and address and social insurance number, they've got your fingerprints. Even in those states, there's been no change in the level of thefts of metal. Now, I think that's quite telling because, if we're going to learn by evidence, as the Minister of Health says, then we ought to look and say, what is the evidence? Has anywhere in the world dealt with this problem, and have they had success? And so we see an even more draconian level of sort of paperwork and requirements. That's a pretty serious invasion of privacy, asking for your fingerprints. And I think there are a lot of people who would think it was an invasion of privacy to provide the kind of detail that the government may be writing into their regulations. But, I think that this is very important that we look at what other jurisdictions may have had success. And from my scan of all of North America, nowhere has. And the American states are the ones that have brought in stronger regulations and stronger penalties. And yet it hasn't made a difference in their conviction rate. It hasn't made a difference in their level of theft. So that brings us back to, why is the bill even before us? And I think it's purely a political bill. It's a bill to make it look like the government is doing something about a problem that is important, about homeowners that have been impacted, about thefts of just small amounts of wire that can cause huge loss of oil and environmental oil spills, for example. We know that that there can be a danger around utility poles, that sort of thing. Those are problems, but this bill isn't going to do it. But I just see the government saying, well, here, look what we've done. And you can waive the bill and you can pretend that it was effective. But I can tell you within a couple of years, we'll have some evidence and some data, and we'll be able to say it did nothing but put some businesses out of business, or cut their employment levels because of the impact on this. And maybe the minister could go tour them and see the room full of paperwork that they'll have set aside on every transaction that they've done for the last however long. And you'll see that it really will not be effective. So I think if you could just project, or pardon me, Mr. Speaker, if the government could project itself into the future and consider whether this will be effective, I think that it will be very clear that you will then say that the member from Halifax Clayton Park was right in her concerns about this and in signaling that consultation with the industry would have been a better way to go. And there's still time, Mr. Speaker, for the government to say, let's do that consultation. Let's bring this back in the spring when we have a better idea. Let's take a little bit of the important time that the Justice Minister has. We know how busy he is. Just maybe he could allot a little more time and perhaps assign a little bit more of his staff time towards consultation and genuine attempts to work with an industry. I know that may not be the natural proclivity of the NDP, but just try it. I think it'll get you a lot more friends in the long run. A government would win a lot more friends, Mr. Speaker, if they did that. That's the way to move forward. I feel that this bill is going to be used just for political purposes when in fact it will prove to be absolutely ineffective in the long run. And Mr. Speaker, I think I've already explained my reasons for that, so I'll be looking forward to law amendments when we will hear more again from, I hope, from the industry, perhaps from people who are concerned, maybe from law enforcement officers as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand and maybe speak a few moments on this scrap metal bill. Mr. Speaker, we do see a problem when it comes to scrap metal in this province and how it's being taken care of, and the opportunity for theft to happen in our province. You know, how many of us have now heard of oil lines being cut and oil lines being sold as scrap? And to look at the damage that creates. I myself have had the opportunity to tour around the Legion in Lower Wedgeport. The Legion in Lower Wedgeport was broken into insofar as they cut the lines. All the tank of oil, which apparently was a full tank of oil, leaked on the backside of the Legion, and therefore needed remediation. And if we know remediation costs, especially for oil, it can be phenomenal. And I forget the dollars and cents, of course, that they had to go and spend on something that, you know, really wasn't their fault, wasn't their real responsibility. And we all know that the issue of Legions across this province that they have in just maintaining the services of keeping a hall open, being able to offer some services to their communities. So, you know, just that fact, I think, in my mind, warrants us to look at this issue a little more closely, to come up with some kind of mechanism in which to deter individuals from looking at some kind of theft when it comes to that. What are we using money for? What are they using money for? Why are you stealing scrap metal? You know, copper and other pieces like this come with a high cost to them, so they can actually pay for drugs, so they can pay for things that are required. We talk about bells and monuments. I mean, how many times have we seen in the paper over the last months and years of bells, church bells or placement bells that are being stolen to be melted down for something else? Even the monument to Pope John Paul's visit back in the 80s was stolen off the Commons not so long ago, and will probably ended up being melted down, used for something else. But had there been a mechanism in place that could have maybe deterred this, could have stopped this, or at least stopped it dead in its tracks, where at least it would have been caught by someone. Now, we can talk about construction. How many of the construction trade would tell you that they don't leave any equipment behind. If you're building a house, you're not going to be putting any wiring in early in your construction phase, because what happens to it, unless your property is secured, that thieves will come in and rip the wires right off the walls in order to sell that. And I've heard of some contractors putting wires up in a building 3 or 4 times, and to show up in the morning again and everything's ripped out again, that they have to start all over again. This costs money to the business, this costs money to the homeowner, and it's just not right, Mr. Speaker. So we need to find a way to do this. So, you know, a scrap metal bill is something that I think we in the Conservative caucus tend to agree with. Now, do we agree everything in the bill? Well, no, Mr. Speaker. We feel that there's some shortcomings in this bill, things that need to be strengthened. Matter of fact, we put our own bill in that we felt is a little stronger and does, you know, approach some of these things when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to other things that's done in a much more appropriate way. But then again, we have a bill that's being discussed by this government that I think requires or needs due consideration. You know, Mr. Speaker, it does create a bit of a confused response where, you know, it did seem to come in at a different time. It seems like ours came in and then they rushed to try to get their own bill in. So, you know, I guess they're just trying to beat us to the punch in this one. Well, that's okay. That's okay. If the idea comes, doesn't matter where the good idea comes from, at least it's being enacted on this. We do feel that it doesn't really do anything meaningful to discourage that oil line theft, and it does, in our estimation and from our review, it does mess with some long-established legal tests. It will create some more litigation. It'll create more costs, maybe some more uncertainty, some more delay in the justice system. And the issue of civil liberties, as I mentioned earlier, is very surprising for a party that often held civil liberties close to heart, to have something that impacts that in so far as that goes. We have the alternative bill that does address these problems. Anyway, trading in oil lines is sort of a topic that I do want to continue on a little bit more. You know, it doesn't make it an offense within this bill to buy and sell used oil lines. You know, as I said before, this is going to be a very expensive issue. You know, just from my experience, and I mean, I don't know how many buildings we can drive by seeing it getting dug up all around the buildings, and the dollars and the cost to the homeowners that this is creating. But we find that you know, it doesn't necessarily stop that from happening. We know from our conversations with scrap dealers that it is sometimes very hard to find it in a pile of scrap. So if you're bringing a truckload of scrap into to a dealer, you know, it's hard to tell within that pile what's oil line and what's not. But you know, this action by specifically looking at that product shouldn't be that difficult, because you can make it illegal to buy or sell something that looks reasonably like an oil line. I mean, I know what an oil line looks like, and I know many of you know what an oil line looks like, so it shouldn't be that hard to find. And in particular, that certified installers are the only ones really permitted to handle them anyway. I mean, me as a private citizen, I really wouldn't even know where I'd go procure an oil line in order to replace one at a home. And then again, I don't have an oil tank, so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for me anyway. You know, listen, you know, we got to take away the market for those individuals. I mean, because right now they can cut these things, they can throw them in the back of a truck, and they can show up at a scrap dealer. And I'm not saying that all scrap dealers are bad. In a lot of cases, they're very busy. They're looking at loads and loads of scrap and all mixed together, and most of it can look legitimate, but hiding in it somewheres, you know, if you're not doing your work, these things can get missed. So, you know, we're hoping that, you know, some of these things can be looked at. You know, we feel that the government bill has some complications that need to be ironed out. And we have to, like the previous speaker was talking, is that we'll have to wait for those regulations that will be created in, you know, by this bill. You know, what are those regulations going to look like? You know, and can we do them quickly? You know, there's a whole other year. You know, I know how regulations go. It takes a long time to get them drafted. It takes a whole lot of time to get them approved, and then maybe they not be effective enough to do this. So, you know, during that time, during that wait, more oil lines are getting cut and being used for things like buying drugs and others. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, the legal test that we need to look at is the issue of warrants. You know, the proper ways to deal with search warrants, of course, is under the Summer Proceedings Act. It's a well-established, complete set of rules and a clear test. So normally, if searches to be done under the Act gets added to Schedule B and Schedule of the Some Pro Act. Implicitly, the government is messing around with that, Mr. Speaker. Section 9, paragraph 1, or 9, bracket 1, allows application for warrant if a person won't allow an inspection or if they interfere with that inspection. So is this a new test? And if so, there is really no oversight of police. Is Schedule B to the Some Pro Act being amended? You know, some questions around that one. So if test of Section 9 of the Scrap Act plus the Some Pro Act, the government is creating uncertainty with a poorly conceived act in our mind. In the legal system, uncertainty leads to more court proceedings. It leads to higher costs and, of course, more delays, all of which are, of course, bad outcomes for all those that are involved in it. And then finally, I think, you know, I'd like to talk about what kind of defenses apply for the strict liability offenses like this, or take a common example in the Motor Vehicle Act. An accused can resort to a handful of well-defined and well-known defenses. These rules are, of course, applicable through the Summary Proceedings Act and how it adopts rules in the Criminal Code. Section 8 of the Criminal Code adopts common law defenses. Due diligence is one. and the most common, but there are others: entrapment, officially induced error, and necessity are other examples. So government interfering with some of these well-established legal regimes, which works well, has some uncertainties that, of course, we would like maybe have some further clarity on some of those issues. 13.4 creates defense of due diligence, yet far less said about it than the Supreme Court of Canada has to say about defining the common law defense. So we asked Mr. Speaker whether this is a new test. Is this an additional defense that is available? Does the fact that one defense has been set out mean that other common law defenses are no longer available to an accused? Again, uncertainty, which equals more court time, more money, and of course, more delay. So, Mr. Speaker, scrap dealers may have wanted something said, but they were better protected by the common law defenses and should be careful of what they ask for. Mr. Speaker, again, you know, even though we underline a number of, I think, deficiencies that we're finding in here, I think there are a number of things that can be strengthened. Maybe we can learn from the act that we brought forward. Maybe there's some things in there that we can meld together and make a good bill that, of course, will protect citizens of Nova Scotia, and so far as protect homeowners and others within Nova Scotia when it comes to the theft of scrap metal. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill this evening, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to stand in my place today and say a few words, because I do have a couple of scrap metal dealers in my riding, and they've obviously have made a few comments to me. But first of all, I would have to say on the title of the bill, Safe Collection of Scrap Metal Act. And the very first thing that the scrap metal dealer said to me, our scrap metal dealers having a lot of accidents on their premises. That was the very first thing he wanted to know. Has WCB initiated this bill that we're going to have a safer workplace and not as many injuries and so on? Because this is really a misnomer that is being portrayed on the public of Nova Scotia. This is a very, very important industry in our province, and we as a province that have moved very strongly, with recycling. In fact, we can call ourselves a world leader in that department, and collecting scrap metal is again a way to beautify our province and to keep metal that is needed in the industry, non-ferrous metals, to continue to be used where they are so needed in industry. And the one thing that again I had pointed out by one of the dealers I chatted with, was in fact, was this bill really going to solve anything around the theft of metal? Now, I can understand where, government, again, looked at a few situations and said perhaps there is some capitalization on the perception that this is a massive problem in the province, that we're going to frame a bill that will look like we're correcting it. Because, the dealers that I spoke with certainly didn't see this as going to solve anything. Look, we all know of some heartbreak cases, I'm sure. In my community, the Auburn Anglican Church, St. Mary's Anglican Church, I think the second oldest in the province. Their church hall had a theft of probably 6-8 feet of copper pipe, and $70,000 later, right? They're dealing with the issue. Last year, I had a couple, a seniors couple who had gone to Florida, and the thief broke into their house and stole every bit of exposed copper and what they could actually pull through the walls. Now, was it solved? Absolutely not. Not in either of the two cases, and they both got tremendous amounts of investigation. How are you going to track, copper pipe in a scrap, through these scrap metal dealers. It's very unlikely, and it's only going to be, again, some information that the police will procure and obtain through investigation in the community. And even then, as we now know, convictions are even much more difficult. I think many of us in this House have learned that the more we consult with the stakeholders, with people who want some legislative action to correct the problem, to deal with a deficiency that legislation currently has, we know that consultation is in fact the best way to go. And again, this is what we're hearing from the industry, is that they were truly not consulted with this whole issue. And they worry about the potential costs, the potential fallout for their industry, and perhaps they would have received a couple of other good consultative remarks about the ways in which government could actually help their industry, and that perhaps would have been a good use of their time as well, because dealers will tell us, and perhaps they told the minister, that one of their biggest concerns is actually theft from their scrap metal yards, and in fact in the major players that is a problem, and they sometimes unknowingly buy back metal that has been stolen from their property, because the identification of lengths, 10, 12-foot lengths of copper pipe, there simply is none whatsoever. And, again, if they may be able to, work with government to deal with some way in which they could have perhaps, additional monitoring and so on of their properties. We've gone through this exercise in this House, and I thought all of us, I think all of us here, if we're, truly honest about what we heard from the scrap metal dealers, from their association, we wouldn't be going down this road again in 2011, because they told us very clearly that in 2008 and once again in 2011, there's nothing in the bill that will enhance the ability of prosecutors to get a conviction, unless it's specifically marked. Yes, if we do have some major monument and so on that has markings on it, there may be, in fact, some possible way in which, again, tracking and conviction can be made. So essentially, unless a thief is caught red-handed, the industry says really there isn't going to be prosecution, and there won't be penalties there as well. The industry is saying that perhaps about 5% of a total of 16 to 18 million tons of scrap metal is actually stolen. Whether it's from one of the electrical companies, whether it's again small contractors, up to 5% is probably of a stolen nature, and really a lot of it will depend and fluctuate. If we go back and we take a look through a couple of decades, we'll see that it really is a determinant of the world price of a particular metal. there are great highs and lows in terms of how much is actually stolen from year to year. So the dealers are basically saying the bill will not affect demand, and again, it's that world commodity, and we know that this bill is certainly not going to play into this. And as we look across the country, we don't have jurisdictions going down this road. It is truly an unregulated industry, and from time to time, dealers are able to pick off somebody. Dealers work with police on this issue. The dealers who provide a good business, a necessary business, provide employment for other Nova Scotians, they carry this out with all the legitimacy of any other business, and if they see some kind of pattern or trend, they're concerned about that information is passed on. And so they will work with police where it's necessary, when it's necessary. But now we truly wonder about whether the implications of this bill. Will it require much more police work, court time, and if the current, when there is, in that very rare case, when there is a prosecution, generally it's based on the price of the materials, and it doesn't really take into account the tremendous amount of costs of police work, of court work, in terms of the prosecution. So we really have, another issue and another problem in that regard. And the scrap metal dealers in my area say unequivocally that the house lot of material that was stolen in a community in my riding last year, there's probably a 90% chance that it left the province. It did not go. Again, being worried and wondersome about, was there something there that could have been picked up and identified, if you wish, something relating particular to a house lot. So it's not likely to show up even in one of our scrap metal dealers' yards. So I'm hoping that that this bill, will get a second look, because the real danger is not upon us yet, and that is the regulations. What will be the regulations that will come forward that perhaps place a tremendous burden on these dealers, and that would be again an unfortunate development, that a piece of legislation, while having the appearance of doing some good, in fact will not solve a problem, and in fact could be costly to a business. So that's an obvious concern that we are facing. So I would hope that during law amendments, Mr. Speaker, that we will hear from those that should have been consulted in the first place, and that with some of the compelling arguments I know they'll bring forward, that government will truly take a look at whether this bill should pass in any form through the House, and perhaps that very, very strong look can in fact move this piece of legislation from moving into law in this province. I know I look forward to what those who will appear before us, because we know that in 2008 they came with some very, very compelling arguments as to why it should not go forward. And in fact, in the strongest terms, they said, this is a political bill only. It's only a way for the government to say, hey, look, we're doing something here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank my colleagues for their very insightful and enlightening comments during the debate of Bill 90. When I opened the debate, I talked about how the safety of Nova Scotians has been put at risk by thieves stealing metal. It also threatens the environment and the economy. Mr. Speaker, we believe this legislation will help prevent this crime. We believe it will make Nova Scotians safer and more secure. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I move the second reading of Bill 90.
Thank you. The motion before the House is second reading of Bill number 90, the Safe Collection of Scrap Metal Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 90, entitled An Act to Regulate Transactions by Scrap Metal Dealers and Recyclers.
Order that this bill be sent to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nice to see you. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 93, the Education Act?
Bill number... Bill number 93, the Education Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to rise today and speak to Bill 93, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill will improve the oversight process for teacher certification and granting of permits. As the legislation stands today, the Minister of Education is responsible for making decisions related to issuing initial teacher certificates and permits, and is responsible for hearing appeals of those decisions. By legislation, I, as the Minister of Education, am responsible to hear appeals and make rulings on decisions I have previously made. This is neither appropriate nor balanced for our hardworking teachers. Teaching our young people is one of the most important jobs we have. Those individuals who are applying for their teaching certificates or permit deserve to have an open and transparent process available to them, including the right to appeal their position to an unbiased third party. Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to conducting the business of Nova Scotians in an open and transparent way, and the current legislation is simply not good enough for our teachers. Bill 93 will shift the responsibility for decisions about initial teacher certification and permits to a Department of Education administrator. The person will be responsible for applying the rules and regulations as they are currently written, and will approve the certificate or will approve or not approve the certificate or permit application. Mr. Speaker, should the applicant feel the decision is in any way unjust or does not properly apply the rules, then that individual will have the ability to make an appeal to the minister. The minister will then have the ability to review the appeal where no previous knowledge or history is with the applicant. Mr. Speaker, the rules and regulation of teacher certification will remain as they are today. Nothing will change those. The amendment only shifts the responsibility of approval from the minister to a senior department official who has the ability and expertise to properly review the applications and enforce the regulations. Mr. Speaker, this is the way a fair and transparent process should work in a democratic system, and that is why government proposed and supports this amendment. Our teachers deserve to have a clear and transparent process to follow, one that is free from even the appearance of unfairness. Mr. Speaker, I think this is a reasonable amendment, and I look forward to further debate from my colleagues across the aisle. Thank you. Oh, thank you. And I move that Bill 93 be now read a second time.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise at my place today and speak to Bill 93. And I do want to say that at my request, staff from the Department of Education did come to give
those of us in our caucus a bit of a briefing on this. That request was made, Mr. Speaker, because try as we could as we reviewed the legislation, we could not understand why such a trivial piece of legislation was coming before the House. We have, Mr. Speaker, as you know, a bit of a crisis in funding in public education in our schools, and we would have welcomed any legislation that spoke to improvements for students in our school, improvements for teachers teaching in our classrooms, and improvements for parents who need and want to know that the resources that their children need are there. And so we made the request. Staff did come in. And, Mr. Speaker, staff were not able to find anything in that legislation that we had not been able to find. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when staff were speaking with us, they were very honest, they were very open, and they responded to a question when it was asked, what difference will this legislation make in what happens in our public schools? What difference will this make for teachers teaching and students learning? And we were told that it would not make any difference. The question was asked, what will this look like? People from outside looking in, will they see any difference? And Mr. Speaker, the answer was no. And so it's because of that failure of an education bill to speak to some of the issues that are prevalent in our public school system with the reduction in funding is what has caused us some concern. When you look at the bill, the minister has said that the bill will clarify the process for teacher certification. That is what the minister has stated in the press release, that it will clarify the process for teacher certification. Mr. Speaker, not one thing will change in the process for teacher certification. The second comment, Mr. Speaker, is that it will enhance all teachers' understanding of the process. Well, if the process hasn't changed, and if there's no education component in the bill, then I question how the minister can say that it will ensure all teachers understand the process. So those two statements are what we were looking for. There has to be something here, and Mr. Speaker, it is not there. We could not find it. It is not there. When you speak about an act respecting teachers, there are so many things that the minister could bring forward that would be respecting teachers. And I know that there are a couple of educators across the floor, the member from Hants East, the member from Timberley Prospect, who I know understand and value public education. And they have seen it from the eyes of a teacher, from the eyes of a...
Order, please. The chatter is getting a little loud in the chamber. The honourable member for Colchester North has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those two members that I've mentioned, the member from Hants East, the member from Timberley Prospect, educators who I respect. And I know that those educators have a lot of good ideas about how public education can be improved. I have had the opportunity to work with one of those members in a capacity where I believe some of the decisions that were made were enhanced because of the input from 2 or 3 educators sitting down together to try to decide what is in the best interest of kids in this province. So I would encourage those members to try to convince the minister that legislation respecting teachers can be a lot more meaningful and a lot more substance to it than something like Bill 93. You know, to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we're going to establish a registrar of teacher certification. Well, I guess I will tell my age, but I've been around here a long time, probably longer than most people, not in this building, but in education. And there has always been a registrar of teacher certification. So to suggest that this is establishing the position of registrar of teacher certification really is quite misleading, because there's always been one. Then to suggest that it will be somebody within the Department of Education, well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? That's where the registrar of teacher certification is now.
The third thing, to suggest that this person is going to be able to review applications for teacher certification, for teacher permits, it's exactly what that registrar does now. So there is nothing in this bill that will make anything any better for teachers teaching or for students learning. You know, Mr. Speaker, we have a government that is intent on slashing funding to public education, disregarding what teachers, parents, Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Nova Scotia School Boards Association, all of those 5 partners that we've talked about, those are the voices that this government should be listening to, not the voice of somebody who wants to balance the books on the backs of the kids in this province. And that's exactly what's happened, Mr. Speaker. When somebody can take... Mr. Speaker, when someone can take $36 million out of a public education budget and then have the minister stand up and say that this will not have any impact on students in the classroom is absolutely ludicrous. It cannot happen. So, Mr. Speaker, we would have welcomed a debate on public education. We would have welcomed something that would be, as the title says, respecting teachers. This does nothing to respect teachers. It does nothing to improve student learning. It does nothing to improve the delivery of education in our public schools. We have a situation where the funding has been cut. The Minister of Finance likes to brag about funding cuts have to parallel the declining enrollment. Well, what the Minister of Finance doesn't admit, I expect he knows, but doesn't admit, that when you have an inclusion policy in the public school education system, that you have the needs of many, many kids who need to be met. And those needs are being met by special programs. And one-on-one intervention programs, Mr. Speaker, are costly. So the question is, do we want to be all-inclusive? Do we want to welcome every student into our school? Do we want to provide programs that help meet their needs? And I maintain, Mr. Speaker, that we do. And I would expect that every member in this House wants to do that. But I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that you can't do that if you're going to continue to gut the education system and take out the supports that have been put in place for those kids who have those special needs. A bill that would speak to that would be much more respecting teachers than Bill 93, which really does nothing, absolutely nothing, to make any difference in how kids learn or how teachers teach in our schools. So, Mr. Speaker, I will repeat that the Office of the Registrar is there. It has been there. It's clearly identified what the Registrar does. The staff who briefed us said nothing will change, and the legislation certainly does not identify anything that will change. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I have to tell you I'm disappointed. I would welcome some legislation which was speaking to education. And, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that at least a few of the educators on the government side would help make the others on that side understand the importance of public education.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of my caucus colleagues to speak in favour of Bill 93. Mr. Speaker, this legislation creates more transparent and appropriate process for teacher certification in Nova Scotia. Although it does not change the way that the teacher is certified or what they need for certification, it does transfer the authority for teacher certificates to the Register of Teacher Certification. The Minister of Education will now be removed from hearing appeals on her own decisions. Mr. Speaker, any initiative that increases transparency in the process and ensures a reasonable separation of powers and responsibilities is, in the opinion of those in the Progressive Conservative Caucus, a positive step forward. This will allow the Minister to use her time more effectively on important issues at hand. Issues such as budgeting, bullying, and issues in the classroom. After all, Mr. Speaker, we do know that this model has been tried and tested in several other jurisdictions in Canada, and here in Nova Scotia, we're always looking for good ideas, regardless where they came from. By making sure teachers are aware of the process involved in obtaining a teaching certificate, and by ensuring the appeal process is fair and transparent as possible, the members of this House will have fulfilled an important obligation to our teachers and to the students they serve. The members of the Progressive Conservative Caucus support this amendment, and we look forward to seeing the changes implemented in a timely and effective manner. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and say a few words on Bill 93 that's before the House. Yeah, another old teacher, you're right. I think I might be actually older than the honourable member from Colchester North. But I'll get a chance to talk about how the teacher certification system works in our province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill that's before the House, according to the Minister, will move the authority for teacher certification to a department administrator. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, I was quite surprised in hearing the Minister in her opening comments on second reading on Bill 93. Let me tell you why I'm surprised, Mr. Speaker. I thought, it already existed within the department. To my recollection, the Department of Education has always had a registrar responsible for teaching certification. When I started teaching way back in the late 1970s, I had to apply. I had to apply for a teacher's license through the registrar, through the Department of Education. Mr. Speaker, Brett Woodbury that occupied that position for many, many years. Yes, I'm quite old. And I suspect some of my colleagues in this House, Mr. Speaker, probably work through Mr. Brett Woodbury's office as well in order to obtain their teaching license over the years. But like we all know, Mr. Woodbury decided to move on, retire from his position, and move on to bigger and better things. So when I look at the bill that's before the House, this is going to allow the minister to appoint somebody within the department responsible for teaching certification, then I'm asking myself, well, we've had this for, since I've been around, and probably prior to my teaching career back in the late 1970s. So again, I'm kind of confused why Bill 93 is before the House. I did have an opportunity to sit in with my colleague from Colchester North when we had the opportunity to meet with the minister's staff to go through this proposed piece of legislation. And again, in terms of what is this legislation going to change, what's this piece of legislation going to do in order to make teaching certification better, improving the system? There was absolutely nothing. So again, Mr. Speaker, I fail to understand why this bill is before the House. We've had a registrar within the Department of Education for many years that has been basically doing what this piece of legislation proposes to do. Now we have the new registrar, Mr. Darren Osborne, and his staff that will continue providing this service to our teachers in the province. So as I pointed out, I fail to understand why the minister is bringing this legislation forward. to move the authority for teacher certification to a department administrator, which already exists within the Department of Education. Maybe when the minister closes debate on the second reading on this bill, maybe she could provide further clarification why this change that she proposes, so that everyone can understand, will certainly improve or change something within the department, which I fail to understand, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill allows me to bring a concern directly to the minister's attention. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I was contacted by this newly graduated teacher from Clare that contacted my office to advise me that she is attempting to get her teaching license after she just graduated at the end of October here, October 31st, and was told that it's going to take her between 4 and 8 weeks in order to get her teacher's license. So, of course, my very first question is, why does it take this long to take a teacher's license? Université Saint-Anne has contacted the Department of Education to advise the department that this student has graduated and met all the obligations under the Bachelor of Education degree. So, of course, failing to understand why it takes so long, I contacted the new registrar, Mr. Darren Osborne, and I told him that I failed to understand why it takes this young teacher 4 to 8 weeks in order to get her teaching license. Well, I did have a chance to speak with Mr. Osborne. He certainly took the time to explain to me why it takes some time to process an application. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, he was very helpful, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Osborne for his assistance this morning. Now, Mr. Speaker, maybe not in Metro Halifax, but I can tell you in many schools, especially in rural Nova Scotia, having been in school administration, I know some of our principals and vice principals at times have difficulties in finding people to come in to replace teachers that are ill or out on training. And many times, principals have to turn to retired teachers and try to convince them, we need your help today. Could you please come in? And many retired teachers I know are doing sub work in our schools, but many retired teachers have spent their whole career in teaching, and arriving after spending 30 some odd years inside the classroom, a lot of these teachers are not really interested in returning back to do some sub work in our schools. And then I look at this young teacher, that's eager, to go and work. Right now, she told me that she's involved in doing volunteer work in the school that she's in. She sees, teachers, sub-teachers coming in on a regular basis. She certainly would love the opportunity to come in and do some work for the school board for that school, but unfortunately, she can't. She has to wait, as I've said, between 4 and 8 weeks in order to obtain her teaching license, in order to allow her to work for the school board. So maybe, Mr. Speaker, the minister could certainly consider looking at improving the system to allow young teachers, in order to obtain their teaching licenses, maybe quicker than having to wait between 4 and 8 weeks in order to get their teaching license, in order to be able to do work for the respected school board. So, Mr. Speaker, again, I failed to see what Bill number 93 will change. You know, I suspect this bill will go through second reading and will come back from law amendments and eventually will go through third and final reading and will pass in this House. But in the end, it changes absolutely nothing. As I've pointed out, we've had a registrar within the Department of Education for many years that already looks after providing licenses and helping teachers upgrading their licenses. So when I hear that this will allow the minister to appoint somebody within the department that will administer teacher certification within the department, well, we already have it. So why are we reintroducing this bill to allow us to basically just continue with what we already have in place? So I hope in the minister's closing remarks, when she wraps up second reading on this bill that's before the House, Mr. Speaker, that she will, again, try to clarify why we need this bill at this time before the House, Mr. Speaker. So with those few words, I will take my place. Thank you kindly.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, and pleased to join the debate this evening and offer you know, a few words. And I guess maybe not only have I perhaps had too many years teaching, but maybe too many years here in the House, because I like productive debate. and obviously this bill, Mr. Speaker, is for the record of a certain number of bills, I guess, that government should put out in a very weak fall session to date. So I guess it's to add to those numbers because, as my colleague said, we've had a registrar, we've had an assistant. Maybe we still have an assistant registrar. But I know that over the course of especially the years in administration, when a teacher would graduate from a full-year program, such as Memorial has, and as we have moved to one or two of our institutions in Nova Scotia that offer a year-long education program, you know, it seems for some reason that when they graduate September, early fall, there is an enormous length of time before they're actually able to get in the classroom. Perhaps there's identification of our students in Nova Scotia well to their final year of the two-year program or even a year program. Maybe the names are forwarded early to the department with the documentation, and those who reach final graduation get processed maybe seemingly a little bit quicker. But I'm not sure if this bill, Bill number 93, is going to facilitate that process in any way. And it's the one that I have heard from, I guess, around registration most often during my career in the classroom, and especially when I was in charge of having substitutes come in to West Kings District High School, and especially when a former student, and I know for teachers, having a former student come back as a teacher is a very special moment. And I know perhaps you as one of their teachers or administrator in some way perhaps fostered and or even helped them discover a little bit that they had a gift to be able to communicate. They had a gift of being able to deal you know, even with their peers. As the educators in this House know, peer education is in fact a very powerful part of the teaching process. And every now and then, I know with my grade 12 students, I would often say, you know, think about teaching. Think about teaching. And because it is truly a wonderful career. You know, I think perhaps you know, even right down to when they came back, reminiscing about some of the classroom times that I had with them, or perhaps was their coach. All of these are part of public education, and I would, you know, love to see every member of this House have an opportunity to get up and talk about the value of public education, and that we are at a critical juncture as we take money out of public education. We all know that over the last number of years, the school environment is a very, very different one. When I take a look at my colleagues here who had a career or part of their work life, career life in education, they can talk very profoundly about the change that is going on. I have been amazed this fall when 2 elementary teachers in my riding called about mental health issues and wondering, is the mental health strategy, are the new people coming into the Valley District Health Authority, will they have a background in youth and early adolescent mental health issues that could help our teachers in a very, very you know, constructive manner about identification of children with stress and anxiety, and how our teachers could look after them. It is indeed a very, very different classroom today. The inclusive model is one that we embrace, but we know comes with an investment. And we know that by taking money out of the education budget, it is indeed affecting those students and their futures. So, you know, as opposed to Bill number 93, the Education Act respecting teachers, I think the greatest respect for our teachers would be to listen to the concerns that they have, and the fact that they have enormous demands on them. And any time we talk about perhaps another you know, unit coming into public education, another course, another requirement, another binder that will provide you with some additional support for your classroom, you know, they talk about the burdens that they currently have, and I think we cannot reduce the number of frontline people in our schools. We need more than just the teacher in front of 25 or 30 or ever how number of students. It certainly isn't a 12.9 ratio, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, and that's not a figure that we should ever throw out to the public of Nova Scotia. You know, that may be a statistical figure that the department uses, accounting for everybody, but we should tell Nova Scotians that we actually have some classrooms where there are 40 students in front of a teacher, and that's where, if we truly respect teachers, Mr. Speaker, we would in fact be doing something to alleviate that burden that they're facing day in and day out. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure why Bill number, like my colleagues, we're not sure why Bill 93 is before us. We hope that perhaps, you know, before it passes through the House, we'll know what kind of improvements for teachers going through the registration process, in fact, are going to see some significant change that will help their careers. Because I think the real supports that will help their careers are diminishing before their careers even get started. And I think that's really what we should be debating and talking about if we want public education to flourish in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be received as well this late hour of this sitting. No, I'm just going to speak a couple moments on this one, and it's sort of the issue I think that the member for Clare brought up in his discussion. You know, is when it comes to Bill 93, what does it really do to make it not necessarily easier but more responsive in receiving that certification? Because I go back to my experience on this one when my wife was graduating from University of Saint Anne. She was able to. She was sort of a late graduation, so she was in the spring, in the fall. So she would been looking for her certification, for her registration number, like in January, getting ready for doing some suppléance or some substitute teaching. Because as we know, as the year goes on, of course, substitute teacher list seems to gets smaller and smaller because, of course, retired teachers can only put in a certain amount of time before it starts affecting, of course, their pensions. So it took almost 2 months in order to get her certification, to get a registration number. And really, it only happened, you know, because of an intervention that I did at the time of talking to the deputy minister, and I believe I spoke to the minister at the time to try to get this to happen sooner than later. Because the irony of it was that there was a school that had somebody who was leaving to take another job in another province, and we're looking for a substitute immediately to take on a spring session or spring time with a class in Wedgeport. And like I said, it took a number of weeks to talking to a number of different people in order to get that certification to happen. So I hope that through maybe this process that not only are we, you know, freeing up, I believe, the minister's time by taking her responsibility away on this one, but hopefully it will be speeding up the process of certification so that our new teachers, when opportunity rolls around, especially as they graduate in the fall, that they can take jobs as soon as they can, so they can be available to the school boards in order to offer their teaching skills that they, of course, learned from some of our great institutions here across the province. So with that, again, I know the member for Cape Breton North spoke to this one and talked about our support. It does seem like an okay little bill, but we're uncertain of course, what its impact is going to be in making things better to receive teacher certification and getting teachers, of course, into the classroom, of course, where we need them. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable the Minister.
Debate.
The motion before the House is that second reading of Bill number 93, the Education Act. Is I ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried.
Bill number 93, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act, respecting teachers.
Ordered that this bill be sent to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. After the daily routine, we will be calling Bill 94, 95, 96, 98, 100, 102, not necessarily in that order, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I wish you to now rise for the House to meet from the hours of 9 a.m. to noon.
The motion before the House is that the House shall now rise and meet tomorrow from 9 a.m. till noon. All those in favour of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. We have now reached the moment of interruption. We have the Late Show, and the debate tonight is, be it resolved that the Minister of Health and Wellness acknowledge she is responsible for the health of diabetics in Nova Scotia, and a great first step in acknowledging this responsibility would be funding for insulin pumps. And it's been submitted by the Honourable Member for Clayton Park, and I will now call on the member for Kings West.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and very, very pleased to rise in my place this evening to speak to this very, very important issue. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for reading the operative clause for tonight's debate. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, here are the facts. Nova Scotia ranks at the top when it comes to diabetes prevalence and close to the bottom when it comes to managing the disease through medications, devices, and supplies. That is happening in our province, and it is the responsibility of the minister to address. The side effects of failing to properly manage diabetes includes heart attack and stroke, kidney failure, blindness, non-traumatic limb amputation, and depression. Research was presented at the annual MLA dinner for diabetes research information last evening, and one of the, I think, compelling points that was made last evening was use of an insulin pump reduces the likelihood of end-stage renal disease and hence the use of dialysis anywhere between 16 and 24%. Now, just this week, we had an announcement from the Minister of Health about some increased funds for renal dialysis as they plan additional services, probably both in hospital and in the home, which is a